Welcome to 100 Plus, a historical overview of the most important people, places, and ideas of the last 3,000 years. In today's episode, Mike will be providing a flyover of the 17th century, which is one of the most consequential centuries ever. As you will soon see, it was not only full of wars and revolution, but also advances and changes on numerous fronts. Some of the most interesting and important people and some of the most controversial and consequential events in Western civilization unfold during the 1600s.
I recently heard someone say that the 17th century opened in England with the death of Queen Elizabeth I, and it ended 100 years later in New England with the Salem witch trials. And in between those moments, it was a hot, complicated mess at almost every turn. And I thought, yeah, that sounds about right. As you will see, this period between 1600 and 1699 was full of activity. It was full of religious strife, for starters, including, perhaps I should say, culminating with the 30 Years' War, which started in 1618 and really was 30 years long, unlike the 100 Years' War, which was like 116 years long. The 1600s was also an era of advances in things like travel. So think sea exploration and all that's being driven by colonialism. There was a spike in trade, the introduction of ice cream, chocolate, and coffee, perhaps the high water marks of all discoveries. Some would likely be hard-pressed to name things more important than ice cream, chocolate, and coffee. It's also a time of important breakthroughs technologically. Things like understanding of magnetism that leads to understanding of electricity, those kind of small advances. And that's just to start, really. There's a lot of things happening. Perhaps the two biggest 17th century items would be, first of all, the scientific revolution. So think Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Bacon, Newton, Boyle, all of those folks. And then the Enlightenment with names like Kant and Descartes, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, and all of those. And as a result of all this change, there is, of course, political tension and change. We see the fall of the divine right of kings. We see the rise of Parliament. This is when Jamestown is founded. It's during the 17th century that the groundwork is laid for both the U.S. and the French revolutions. It's early in the 17th century that African slaves first arrive in the colonies. During the 17th century, we see the rise of Islam, we see famine decimate Russia, and a whole lot of other things. So some historians call the 17th century the most important century ever. Perhaps. It certainly is significant, and it is crowded. I have a book at home, the kind of book you would never buy today. You would just go on the internet, but it's just about 700 pages of everything that happened in Western civilization. So you have these columns, and it will just list the year, and there's usually about 3 years per page. And it lists the political things that happened, and it lists changes in government, and it lists the developments in literature and in art and in religion and in science. And so you've got these boxes. And what I have noticed, because I just flipped through and look at all these things, just trying to scan them, what I have noticed is that as we got into the 17th century, the boxes start to get a lot more full of type. Lots more things happening. Things become more complicated. So in today's episode, we're going to do an initial flyover. In future podcasts, we will double back on the 17th century and go a little bit deeper. And again, I think we have to, because as I've already noted, there's a lot of important things that happen. A second reason we need to go deeper is because this is a period where a lot of controversial things happen, or where the things that happened are going to be contested. Our description of what happened is going to become more political and more contentious. In my preparation for today's podcast, I was going back and sort of skimming lectures out there on the Enlightenment, and I was reminded of how some people, those hostile to faith, will describe the Enlightenment as the moment when finally the world escaped the dark, dank, moldy superstitions of the church, and the light of reason broke through, and it's a new day, and the sun comes out, and everything gets better. We get rid of all this hocus pocus, mumbo jumbo, religious garbage, and the oppression of the church, and all the inquisitions, and all the just the heavy-handed, dark superstitions of the church. And science comes into its own, and God gets pushed off the throne, and mankind becomes the measure of all things. And for the first time in the history of the world, there's a chance of progress. Not just a chance, but progress can now be expected. And a lot of those that describe the Enlightenment this way will suggest that it's sort of really from that point on, everything sort of goes up and to the right. And really it's all very, let's just say, that's not the way I understand the Enlightenment. I think there's a lot of truth to what is there, but I think that it's a little bit more complicated than that. So we're gonna need to come back and do a little bit of some deeper dives. But in this episode, it's the big picture. So I'm just water skiing over the surface. Hang on. We're going to move quickly. Now, I'm going to cover 5 areas, but before we start, let me say that I want you to hang in there. Please understand, it's not crucial that you understand every event, every idea, the contributions of everybody that I'm mentioning. When we get into the Enlightenment and we start to see different philosophers arguing different worldviews, and you've got Descartes saying, "I think, therefore I am," and it's an understanding of doubt and other things. Some of what goes on there, and the explanations of some of what goes on there, might not find purchase in your understanding. You might be confused. So hang in there. I'm trying to move quickly through some of those things. It's not important that you understand everything. I want you to be exposed to the people and the ideas and the general theme of things. But what I'm really interested in, what this whole project is about, is to help you see the grand flow of history. As I keep saying, when we are born, we enter a conversation that has been going on for several thousand years. And this conversation is dynamic, it is changing. It's important for us to understand who said what before we joined in. It's also important for us to understand how things have been changing. And this is key because what's important for us to understand is, as you look back on history, you might think, if you are the chronological snob that G.K. Chesterton says we are, we look back and we say, wow, back then they believed this. I'm so much more enlightened, if I'll use the operative word for the day, so much better informed. I'm so much smarter than those people are. Well, just note that in 50 years from now, people are going to look back at us and think that we were the yahoos and the country bumpkins, and we didn't understand things. As a matter of fact, it may not be 50 years. I was reading an article this week by Andrew Sullivan, who's a guy who's a little hard to categorize. Sullivan is a self-described as a conservative gay Catholic. And he was the editor of the New Republic, I think that was it, 25 years ago. And then he became like the world's first blogger and is sort of this public intellectual, the first guy to argue for gay marriage. And I've heard him speak a couple times in person. Very fascinating guy, again, hard to categorize. But he's writing this past week and noting that many people have been coming after him for becoming out of touch with the world. And when did he become so, in his case, and I'm not trying to make a political point here, but when did he become so conservative? And so in this article this week, he argues, here's my views, and he cites Obama and Clinton. And he says, I haven't moved. If anything, I moved to the left on my views. But the views that were being articulated by Obama and Clinton are views that would get you canceled today. So things are moving quickly, and we just have to understand we're entering this conversation that is fluid and changing. And I just want you to understand the flow, the trajectory of things. So, as you hopefully know by now, we're about 3/4 of the way through the time frame we're covering. And as we've added Western civilization and not just church history, it's not quite 3/4 of the way, but we're not even halfway through these lectures. We started, Western Civ has us backing up to the Greeks and the Romans, and then also to the Hebrews and to the Christians. And then we follow as everything gets disrupted by this person, Jesus, who changes the world. And initially in the Roman context, things move quietly. The church grows rapidly, but it grows underground because it's illegal. And then with Constantine, we enter the imperial church. And then when Rome falls, we enter into the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, which is divided into those three sections: early, high Middle Ages, and late Middle Ages. And then we come out of that with the Renaissance, and then there's overlap between the Renaissance and the Reformation. We've just been in the Reformation, and we're now moving into a very new era. We're moving into the Enlightenment. And lots of big events, lots of disruption and revolution in the 1700s. By the way, more coming. I mean, we get into the 18th century and we've got the French Revolution, we've got the Great Awakening, we've got the American Revolution, and all the things that unfold there. The 19th century is going to bring growing, I would say, naive optimism. It's also going to bring things like the Civil War in the U.S., and then we get into the 20th century where it opens. The 20th century opens with all this optimism that science and technology are going to change the world for the better, and heaven's coming to earth, and we're all going to become enlightened and secular. And the person pushing back on all this, again, is Nietzsche, the German, famous for saying God is dead. And he's going to argue that the 20th century is going to be a bloodbath, that as the halo of the Christian ethic dissipates, he says we're not going to have campfires where we sing Kumbaya and hold hands and everybody gets along. He says we're going to have just this search for power. And that, of course, is what we see in the 20th century. We have massive world wars and all kinds of issues and problems and communism, and it's a mess. But as always, I'm getting ahead of myself. So more to come. Today, for our purposes, we're looking at a flyover of the 17th century. And to that end, I have 5 categories. And the first one up is philosophy, and in particular, epistemology. Look, I know, oh my goodness, many of you are thinking, are you kidding me? Please don't turn me off just yet. I know that philosophy in general is not many people's favorite topic. And indeed, some of you are thinking, give me something practical. Woodruff, come on. And then when I mention epistemology, you're like, I don't even know what that is. But I know it sounds boring. Epistemology sort of is the word that gets middle schoolers chuckling, like you shouldn't be able to say that in adult conversation. So let me just say, look, I think that philosophy, like theology, is among the most practical things in the world, and that epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy that deals with how we know what we know, is very, very important. And part of what makes the 17th century so important is that it's during this century that the West's epistemological assumptions change. And when they did, or perhaps I should more accurately say, where they did, everything else changes. So I know, again, thinking about thinking is takes a lot of thinking, and we often avoid this. It's much easier to just study history in terms of people. When I was in grad school, I had a number of history classes, and they were taught principally by two different church history professors. One was all about people and stories, and the other was all about ideas, the history of ideas. Now, you don't have to wonder who was the more popular professor. Everybody loves stories. Stories are so much more interesting than philosophy per se or ideas. And so everybody wanted to take all their church history classes from the professor that focused on stories and on people. However, as I look at this, and I try to tell stories here, but as I look at this, I think it's the ideas that inform the stories, and we have to occasionally slow down long enough to tease these things out. Cultures are based on assumptions, and part of what makes them so powerful and so necessary for us to call them out and look at them is because they largely are invisible to us. They operate by stealth. So you've heard of culture shock. Culture shock is when you run into somebody from another culture whose invisible assumptions are different than yours. And you think, how in the world could anybody think that? Why in the world would anybody do that? Well, we need to understand and highlight and shine light on these different assumptions. And these assumptions are informed by epistemological starting points. So, look, I think that the way to understand epistemological starting points, I've shared this in other settings in the past, is to say, just as if you're playing a game of cards, there are four suits: diamonds, hearts, spades, and trump, diamonds, hearts, spades, and clubs, and you have to figure out which of these suits is the most powerful, which of these suits. And there is no avoiding using the word trump. It is so complicated to use the word trump today, but you're wondering which of these suits has the default power. Well, when you move into philosophy, you see that there's not four suits. I mean, we're not talking about diamonds and hearts and spades and clubs. We're talking about four sources of authority. We're talking about reason, revelation, tradition, and experience. And for the most part, what happens in cultures is that these different sources of authority have different weighting. Now, almost everybody today recognizes the value of at least three of these: reason, tradition, and experience. Tradition maybe gets pushed down, but revelation is the one that many people don't like at all. Revelation being the idea that God, that some higher power has revealed truth to us. And this is anathema to many because you can't challenge it as like you can reason is going to lead you into a scientific lab, or you're going to have arguments based on logic and you can debate these things more openly. Whereas revelation, the idea that God has given us a holy book or that God is giving us divine insight, that gets pushed aside. So all of that to say, in the 17th century, for various reasons, the epistemological assumptions change. So I would argue that they change again. As a Protestant, and hopefully this has become clear from where we've been, as a Protestant, I'd say they've changed again. So in the early church, before the book of Acts, the ink is dry, you have authority going to the apostles. And then that apostolic authority is claimed by the New Testament, right? It is transferred to the New Testament. You also had, in the early church, you had the authority of the Bible, but at that point, the Bible is only the Old Testament. So that authority, as a Protestant, I would argue that default authority that goes to Revelation and goes to the Bible, at some point late in the Middle Ages, is claimed in inappropriate ways by the church, which means by tradition. So now you have the church, the Pope, and the authority of the church, pointing not just to the Bible, but pointing to all of the other things, this magisterium, and to the authority of the Pope, that the traditions argue that this has equal authority to the Bible. So now when we get into the 17th century, when we get into the Enlightenment, what we have is the authority being defaulted away from revelation and away from tradition and towards reason. And this will in particular dovetail with science. So another way to explain this, another way to think about this is that early on authority, so how do we know what we know? Where's our epistemological basis? Early on authority can be categorized or can be caricatured as being held by an older male religious official who's holding a religious book. And everybody sort of gets their marching orders from this religious figure that says, this book says this. This is what's true. That is going to change, and now, as opposed to being an older male religious leader pointing to a book, a religious text, it's going to be, if I sort of bring this forward, it's going to be a middle-aged scientist, male or female, in a white lab coat, who's not going to point to a religious text, but who's going to point to data, studies, research shows, right? That's the highest form of truth we have now. What did we discover in the lab? Now, interestingly, again, it doesn't stop there. So you could say that the older religious figure pointing to the religious text, this is the traditional world or the pre-modern world. When we get into the modern world, that person is the scientist. We have moved, by most people's estimation, into a postmodern world, and the person that we look to now is no longer the person in a lab coat citing studies. The person we look to now that seems to be the most influential in terms of defining truth is the celebrity, or it's the rock star, or it's the therapist telling us to look inside ourselves and to find truth there. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, let me just note, first thing to know about the 17th century is the epistemological assumptions change. The second thing to note is that because these epistemological assumptions change, or alongside these epistemological assumptions changing, we end up with the scientific revolution, which is one of the biggest revolutions of all time. We're going to look ahead at the French Revolution and the US Revolution, and there's important revolutions on the political front. Scientific revolution is massive. So it is, scientific revolution is the term used to describe the events that lead to the developments in math, physics, astronomy, biology, especially human anatomy, chemistry, and more. And so these things take place principally in the 1600s, so the 17th century. Most would want to back up to the middle of the 16th century. So 1543 is when Copernicus publishes his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. And the scientific revolution is going to go forward outside of the 17th century into the 18th century. So several things to note about this. The key behind the scientific revolution was the scientific method. And the scientific method, actually there's sort of scientific methods. There's not agreement on one specific method, but it's an approach that says we're going to make observations, we're going to sort of form hypotheses, and we're going to test them. We're going to establish ways that they could be refuted, falsified. And then based on the data, based on the research, based on our understanding, we're going to be able to move forward. Key names here, again, I mentioned Copernicus, also Galileo, Kepler, Boyle, Newton, and probably we could back up also to Bacon. Scientists at this stage are often understood to be philosophers of the natural philosophy. And Bacon will see himself actually as a theologian, which sort of leads to the other point I want to make here. The tension that will exist between science and faith is going to grow through the scientific revolution, through the Enlightenment. It's not ugly early on. So important to understand. Again, when we look at the Enlightenment, which is coming up next, some date the Enlightenment as starting back with the Romans and the Greeks, and it's just sort of on this pause for 1,000 years during the Middle Ages. Others will say that the Enlightenment starts mid-17th century, 1650, and goes into the 18th century. So if that's true, and I think that's probably the best way to think about it, the first 75 years of the Enlightenment, the first 75 years of the scientific revolution, there's not as much tension between science and faith as most people think that there is. And in fact, the science grows out of a Christian worldview, grows out of an understanding that the world was created. It's not God. It's ordered because there is a creator who's ordered. And so you can study it and learn things and move forward. And most all of the early scientists, I just mentioned Bacon, Newton, Pascal, all these people are serious Christ followers, and they believe that they are learning in response to God's call to understand the universe. The heavens declare, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. We learn about God, we learn about the Creator by studying the creation. So the third thing that we look at, the first being epistemological assumptions, shifting, the second being scientific revolution, the third I have already mentioned, and that is the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is this movement in which reason pushes revelation aside, man pushes God off the throne, or another way to talk about it is the outgrowth of scientists using the scientific method and turning it towards society at large. So the Enlightenment is a big deal. It's not as rapid of a transition as some people describe it, but it is a big deal. Like the Reformation, when the Enlightenment rolls out, it doesn't simply change the way people think about things. It changes culture, it changes families, it changes jobs, it changes the economy, it changes politics, it changes all of these things. Art, architecture, music, all of these things are going to be changed by the Enlightenment. And early on, as I just mentioned, early on, 1650 to 1725, not nearly as caustic to faith as it will become. You get into the later Enlightenment, so 1750 beyond into the 18th century, and you just have a lot of people who are going to be very openly antagonistic about issues of faith. People like Voltaire, who will write Candide and sort of try and openly mock faith. The fourth area that deserves a bit of comment in our flyover is the area of politics. And on this front, again, lots of moving pieces. You see this in a move away from the divine right of monarchs. So Locke, John Locke is an important figure here. He's born in 1632, he's going to die in 1704, so he's very much a 17th century guy. He's going to make several very important contributions around politics, and one of the first is he writes this book called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And in it, he argues that we are born a clean sheet of paper, tabula rasa, if you've heard that term. We're born as a blank slate. And what he's arguing here is that we're all sort of equal at birth. There is no divine right of kings. So previously, if I'm born to be the king, this is God's will, and you have to stay in your station, and I'm the one that you're going to follow. And so he's going to challenge that whole idea of the divine right of kings to be kings. He's going to argue that we all have rights. To be more precise, he's going to argue that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, you might have thought I was going to say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson clearly is going to be copying, plagiarizing a bit of Locke's thinking here. He will change it in the Declaration of Independence. But you've got Locke writing on that. Locke also will write on the purpose of government, and this will become enormously important in the United States. So Locke will say the purpose of government is twofold. One, it's to write laws, and two, it is to enforce laws. And he will argue that you cannot have the same people writing laws and enforcing laws, because then you're going to get thugs. You're going to get totalitarian kinds of cultures. And so he will argue for the separation of powers, which, of course, is right at the heart of the American experiment. So lots of things are going to change politically. And again, we'll see in England, we're going to see the decline of the power of the monarchy. We're going to see the rise in Parliament. We're going to see lots of We're going to have this foundational thinking that is going to move away from monarchies and the Holy Roman Emperor and all these kinds of things into slightly more democratic forms of government. This will, by the way, grows out of a Christian worldview. Human rights, as we looked at before, you can't really argue for human rights if you are coming at things from a completely secular point of view. You can just say it's obvious, but other people can say it's not obvious. As a matter of fact, a lot of atheists will say it's not obvious at all that humans have rights. We just sort of decide to act that way. So the fifth and final area that I'll mention in this episode has to deal with religion. So when we get into the 17th century, we have what historians and theologians will refer to as the confessional age. So the church is going to establish itself. You got a Roman Catholic Church. You're going to have the Lutheran Church. You're going to have Calvinism. And so each group, you've already seen this, the Council of Trent, the Catholic Reformation, Counter-Reformation. You see the Trent documents. You're going to see the Confessions of Augsburg, so being the Lutheran, you're going to have the Westminster Confession coming out of Calvin. So efforts to sort of establish creedal guidelines for faith. It's during this time you're going to see the rise of the Puritans. I will say more about the Puritans in future podcasts. There's a lot of confusion about the Puritans. They're seen as real prudes and prigs, and all scarlet letter and black clothes and shoes with big belt buckles. None of that stuff is true. One writer said described the Puritans as that group of people that is worried that someone somewhere is having fun and they've got to stomp it out. No. That's not what the Puritans are like. Now, Puritanism is a complicated kind of movement, and in part because you have some Puritans who are calling themselves Puritans because they want to purify the Church of England. They don't believe that under Cranmer and King Henry and King Edward and others that the church was purified enough. Under Queen Elizabeth, that they went far enough, and so they want to move further past the Roman Catholic sort of ideas and ideals and investments and all that kind of stuff. But they will remain within the Church of England. Other Puritans, the separatists, will say that they actually have to move away, and they'll want to come to North America and start over. So you've got a lot to look at with the Puritans. Another big thing in this period, 17th century, as it relates to religion, is the 30 Years' War, and this is so you've got actually lots of conflict, and it's not just conflict because Catholics and Protestants are fighting each other. You got Protestants and Protestants fighting each other, and some of this is all very complicated because what gets defined as religious wars are really political wars because whoever's in charge, their religion is the one that everybody is supposed to embrace. And so it looks like you've got Protestants and Catholics fighting when really what you've got is you've just got kings and princes fighting each other, but they happen to be on other sides of the aisle. So the 30 Years' War will highlight this. The 30 Years' War, again, it starts in 1618, and it's a bad 30 Years' War. It's actually interesting the way it starts. So the Holy Roman Emperor sends some of his people to Bohemia. The Holy Roman Emperor is Catholic, and Bohemia is part of his province, and he wants the people living in Bohemia to stop being Protestant and to become Catholic. And so what happens? Very famous event. The second defenestration of Prague happens. So defenestration means out the window. Earlier in Prague, you had some people show up and get thrown out the window of this castle. They had died. Here, they throw these 4 people out the window of this castle, high castle window. They throw these 4 people out of the window to it's sort of like tar and feathering somebody, is like hanging somebody. It's something that happened. You could get thrown out the window. And so they throw these 4 guys out the window because they're there on behalf of the Holy Roman Emperor to say you've got to become Protestant, or excuse me, you've got to stop being Protestant, you've got to be Catholic. They survive. And there's 2 stories that you can read about how they survived. One story, the Catholic explanation, is that they sort of are carried down on angels' wings and kept alive because God is on their side. The other story, the Protestant story, is that they get thrown out this window and they land in a huge pile of manure. You sort of can't make this stuff up. And the Protestants are all like, oh my goodness, what's worse, dying or landing in this huge pile of manure? But anyway, this is going to start a war. The war was relatively small. Bohemia is not huge, and there's skirmishes, but the war spreads, and you end up with all these other people getting pulled into the war, and it becomes a really, really bad, ugly, brutal period. 30 years. It lasts for 30 years. The French get involved. The Swedes get involved. The Swedes at the time actually not simply the flat packed furniture stronghold. They were actually a military stronghold at the time, and lots and lots of people, lots of civilians are going to die during this time. Of course, when you've got war, you lose your crops, you lose your animals. Everything's being confiscated by soldiers, so it's really bad. But one of the things to note is that at some point, you're going to have Catholic leaders entering in on the side of the Protestants against the Holy Roman Emperor, who's Catholic. And that's because it's not just, the 30 Years' War is described as being a war between Protestants and Catholics. It's just not that simple. Finally, There will be what's called the Peace of Westphalia. This is a very important peace treaty signed in 1648. And it will say we're going to agree to recognize the rights of Catholics, of Lutherans, and of Calvinists to exist, and we're going to stop killing each other. And there's going to be the opportunity for when a prince, basically they go back to what they had before, but when a prince or king or whoever says, okay, this area is going to be Protestant or this area is going to be Lutheran, that people can move. So that will be what is in place because the state is taking over the church again, and that will be what is in place in that area. But people aren't going to be killed for that. They're going to have an opportunity to move in a different direction. So there is, as you can imagine, other things that happened during the 17th century. This is a period. They refer to it historically as the Little Ice Age. And so this ice age, there's climate change back then. And this little ice age that started back in the 15th century is going to become quite problematic in the 17th century. And lots of people will starve to death because of famines. There's something called just the general crisis. If you just Google the 17th century, you'll see that because of conflicts and because of weather changes and because of all these other things, that it's just a period of sort of general malaise in Europe. This is a period when you have your first sort of publicly traded company. The Dutch East India Company is going to introduce this new concept called shares. You can buy shares in the Dutch East India Company. And so you've got a lot of other things happening. By virtue of a survey, we're moving quickly over this. We're going to take a deeper dive into some of these topics, 17th and 18th century, deeper dive into Enlightenment, all these philosophical shifts. We're going to see other things developing as we move through the Enlightenment and deeper into the 17th century and then into the changes. We start to get into things that you're going to perhaps know a little bit more about. We're going to get into the U.S. Jamestown is founded in the 17th century, and so we're going to have the growth of the colonies, and we're going to have all that goes with that and all the religious challenges that go with that. And then the American Revolution. We're going to head into the Industrial Revolution. All these things, of course, change the world in which you and I were born. Have a good day.